BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Kaz Graham, and this is the Farming Today This Week podcast. In this edition, long-awaited trade agreements finally see the light of day.
The US and UK have been working for years to try and make a deal. And it never quite got there. It did with this Prime Minister.
That UK-US trade agreement, what will it mean for British farmers?
We said we had red lines on standards, particularly in agriculture. We've kept to those standards.
More on all of that throughout the programme. But first, it is 80 years this week since VE Day, the end of World War II in Europe. During the war, so many men were away fighting, it was left for the women to take up the slack on Britain's farms. The land girls ploughed, grew crops, milked cows, caught rats, drove tractors, you name it, they did it. Well, one of them was Eileen Webster, who's now 99 and lives near Saffron Walton in Essex. She was just a teenager when she signed up to the Women's Land Army, and she's been sharing her memories of that time with BBC Essex.
I wasn't frightened. You don't really know what it's all about, really, at that age. I wanted to join something when I got to 17. I went to Writtle in Essex and signed up. And I was sent to Takeley in Essex. And I think there was about 16 girls there.
They're all dressed up for the harvest. Land Army girls who, a little while ago, were making dresses or dressing hair.
They was all happy and we did our work and in the morning, sandwiches and went to work on the land, which was very, very hard. The worst season is the winter, because it's so cold. And I remember doing the sugar beet. We had to top and tail it with a big chopper. And, your hands were frozen and you wondered if you was ever going to have an accident. I like the harvest time, although you worked till about 10 o'clock at night. But, you mixed with the village ladies and they used to boil a big pot of potatoes and peas, and we'd eat our sandwiches with them. It was hard, but we all loved it. Can't fault it. I loved it. I always say I had a wonderful time, and I made some lovely friends, and I drove a tractor. I loved that, driving the tractor. Well, they just said, do you want to do it? Because half of the girls were frightened to do it. We was only kids, really, weren't we? But I had a go, and I loved it.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
Well, when they said the war was over, obviously we all got on the train and went up to London. Everybody was so happy and everybody was cuddling each other and kissing and dancing. I was there all night, and when I fell asleep, I was in a cinema entrance. I had my photo taken by a reporter on the Daily Herald.
Lucky she didn't have her back for morning milking, or she would have been in deep, deep water. That was 99-year-old Eileen Webster on her days as a land girl. Now, this week on Farming Today, that's the programme that goes out weekday mornings at 5:45 or anytime you like on BBC Sounds. We have had a bumper helping of spuds. Yes, all week we've been digging into the world of potato production. Growing seed potatoes is a high-value, tightly regulated specialist business. And in the UK, it's largely concentrated in Scotland, where the disease risks are lower thanks to a cooler climate. Europe was a key market for Scottish seed potatoes, but Brexit changed all of that. The EU's plant protection rules mean that the trade is no longer allowed. But as Nancy Nicholson has been finding out, growers have not given up on resuming exports. Planting was in full swing when she joined one of Scotland's top growers in a Perthshire field.
So Nancy, we're planting a nice piece of land here. We're planting at the moment a variety called Cara, which primarily goes to Egypt. So we've got 3 machines getting rid of the stones and clods out of the seed beds that we're preparing, and then 2 planters planting the seeds.
It's a beautiful field of long, straight lines. And with me is Robert Doig, who's a farmer, director of Caledonia Potatoes, and a member of the British Potato Trade Association. And you mentioned there that this crop would normally go to Egypt. Is it sold ahead? Do you know that's where it's going?
Well, it's sold ahead, but it utterly depends on quality. The quality requirements of the Egyptian market are very stringent. So we have to get everything right here. It's a bit of an all or nothing thing, really, because if they go to Egypt, they're really quite high value. If the quality isn't up to the mark, then they become very low value. So it's a really win or bust kind of deal, which is why I don't like to do too much of it, to be honest. We measure how much of that risk we take here.
Europe, of course, was a very important market for Scottish seed until Brexit. There have been numerous attempts at getting that access back to no avail, but you've just recently hosted a delegation from Europe. What did they want to see?
The delegation was over here to look at our bureaucracy, really, our protocols, our traceability standards, in order to make themselves comfortable that we comply with everything they would want from an importing country.
And there's another tractor just approaching. Presumably little has changed, though, in terms of standards since before Brexit. Is it really a political exercise now?
I think that's being a little bit harsh. The EU takes its importation, soil health and all that kind of stuff seriously. And so once we became a third country, their rules were relatively straightforward for them. We were a third country, therefore they couldn't import. So we've got to overcome that hurdle. But you're right, the standards are the same. So in broad theory, there is no reason beyond the fact that their legislation doesn't allow it. So we have to reprove ourselves.
Any feedback yet on how they might progress?
To the best of my knowledge, and the last I heard, there had been no feedback. But the EU moves slowly, as so many democracies do.
And how important? Are we holding this guy up by standing here?
Clearly we are, but...
How will we move, Robert?
But farming today is much more important than planting potatoes. Look, I think it would make a huge difference to the Scottish and UK seed industries. We are heavily reliant on one or two export markets for our sort of structural capacity. You know, any healthy industry can't be over-dependent on one or two markets.
How optimistic are you that you will be exporting to Europe again?
I think we'd all really like to be optimistic about it. I mean, obviously there's this big hurdle to get full access to the market, and we've lost the varieties that we used to export to the EU because we lost the market for them. There would inevitably be a growth phase that we'd have to go through to re-establish that. But potato farmers have to be optimists.
That's Robert Doig with Nancy Nicholson. Well, potatoes are a particularly thirsty crop, so news this week that farmers need to prepare for drought will not be music to the ears of those who grow them. SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, has issued a water scarcity alert as 17 river catchments are so low. England has seen its driest start to spring since 1956, according to the Environment Agency, which led to a meeting of the National Drought Group. Richard Thompson is Deputy Director of Water for the Environment Agency.
Reservoirs used for public water supply are about 84% full on average. You'd normally expect them to be over 90% at this time of year. River levels in the north of England and extending to some parts of the Midlands are lower than where you'd expect them to be at this time of year. And that's where we've seen the driest weather and most of the impacts of that dry weather so far. Across the rest of the country, groundwater levels are good. The underwater aquifers have recharged pretty well over the winter period. And when we look across at farmers who have irrigation reservoirs, they're all reportedly in good shape, pretty full as we start the irrigation season. But obviously, if the wet weather doesn't come back and the dry weather extends, then we might expect to see those go down quite quickly.
However, you have told farmers to prepare for drought, haven't you? I mean, why is that if groundwater levels are okay in parts of the country?
We do work with farmers throughout the year. We issue our prospects for spray irrigation at the start of the year. We've had to downgrade that because of the dry weather to kind of moderate prospects for kind of good water availability. And the reason for that is really because some farmers do rely on surface water abstractions. If river levels start to drop across the country or recede at greater rates, then some of those farmers might start to face licence conditions coming in, which might restrict the amount that they can take. We might consider that as the season goes on, if farmers are taking more water to irrigate their crops, that their reservoirs might draw down quicker. And that might mean problems later on in the season. So that's why we're continuing to work with the agricultural sector and farmers just to say, talk to us early. If you need flexibility, we can work with you, plan your water use, make sure you're prepared, and use water in the most efficient and wisest way that you can.
So although it has been the driest start to an early spring for nearly 70 years, we perhaps don't need to worry quite as much as that headline might suggest.
I think our experience from 2022 was that even a relatively healthy position at the start of the year can deteriorate quite fast. And what we find is that the higher temperatures in particular can accelerate droughts at a rate that we perhaps haven't seen before. So I think it is prudent to be careful, to be planning ahead, preparing for potential further impacts.
Richard Thompson from the Environment Agency. Well, no drought when it comes to trade agreements. None for ages, and then suddenly two pop up in a single week. Farmers have welcomed a new UK trade deal with India, with tariff reductions for whisky, salmon and lamb. The National Farmers Union said that ministers have clearly listened to their concerns around upholding the UK's production standards and the importance of safeguarding the most sensitive farming sectors. However, some campaigners have raised concerns about the standards of some Indian food production, especially in relation to pesticides. Ali Renison, a former advisor on trade to the UK government and now a partner at the strategic advice firm SEC Newgate, gave us her analysis.
India is one of those markets with some caveats that actually farming has more, potential export opportunities for what they produce than import sensitivities. Lamb is a particular offensive interest for the UK. Obviously, the beef market is limited in India because obviously the cow is sacrosanct. But, broadly, I think that India is a more kind of interesting export market for what farmers produce than defensive sensitivities on what gets brought in. One of the big questions will be around sanitary and phytosanitary measures, so SPS provisions that govern these sort of rules and regulations around agricultural trade, for example. But I don't think it's probably likely that the UK government was willing to really negotiate on things like maximum residue levels for pesticides to facilitate that entry into the UK market. And ultimately, there were bigger things that India wanted out of the UK, I think, in terms of insisting on that in the deal.
Ali Renison. Well, hot on the heels of that India trade deal, the UK Prime Minister and the US President announced a trade agreement between the two countries. President Trump hailed it as an agreement which will, in his words, dramatically increase access to UK markets for American farmers, involving, he said, billions of dollars and singling out ethanol, where the UK tariff on American imports will be removed, and beef, where a reciprocal agreement has been made. But the UK ban on American chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-treated beef continues. Since President Trump introduced new tariffs, most UK goods exported to the US faced a 10% tariff, with a 27.5% charge for cars and 25% for steel. Under the terms of this agreement, that 10% tariff remains, for instance, on cheese, but the UK is now able to send 100,000 cars into the US on the lower 10% tariff, and the US tariff on steel will be removed. Ali Renison told Charlotte Smith there is more work to be done.
Well, the first thing to say is it's not a deal. It's sort of an outline framework with baseline commitments. I think that there has been some effort to sort of show that there are some reciprocal arrangements going on, whether you look at what's been agreed that we know of in some of the agricultural space. I mean, I do think that the US is sort of committed to slashing some of its tariffs, not even back to where it was before Liberation Day, as it were, but actually on auto tariffs, we've seen it go down from 25% to 10%, which is a lot higher than what we had before. So I think the main thing to say is that the negotiations are going to continue. This is the start of a sort of process.
On agriculture, the government in the UK is stressing that it is not accepting food produced to lower standards, so no chlorine chicken, no hormone beef. But this agreement does make it easier to import beef from the US, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, we see that there's an announcement of a reciprocal kind of quota arrangement for sort of an extra 13,000 tons for beef. Reading between the lines of what the government is saying is that ultimately we aren't going to change the rules about what we allow to be imported in terms of food safety and production standards on sort of farming produce. But ultimately, we might be looking at basically creating a more generous kind of import allowance for beef that meets the UK standards.
The US Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins talked about this exponentially increasing our beef exports. The US currently makes up 0.05% of UK beef imports. Do you expect to see much change in that?
It depends on, how much of the, let's say, American agricultural sector when it comes to beef can actually produce to UK standards. I think if you compare it with poultry, where actually a lot of poultry and chicken that's being sort of processed and sort of sent abroad is not actually chlorine rinsed the way that it used to be. If you look at some of the data, at least 80% of a lot of beef in America is still produced with hormones. So I think it's a growing potential market for farmers that are willing to have a different approach to the way in which they rear their livestock.
And certainly from what the Agriculture Secretary suggested in the press conference, she is very keen that they look at other meats.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, when you look at sort of speaking to certainly Republican members of Congress that are in big rural agricultural states on my last trip to Washington recently, they want to look at different types of produce that don't have to deal with the same levels of sort of, let's say, ractopamine kind of hormone-treated sort of issues, and potentially create a more diversified market beyond just some of the sort of classical discussion about beef, which is usually what we see in sort of trade discussions between not just the US and the UK, but the US and the EU historically.
Overall, the 10% tariff that President Trump imposed on other goods going from the UK to the US remains. Has the UK given more than it's got here?
I think we can only make that assessment once the full suite of agreements has actually been done. So as I said, this is sort of an outline agreement of some of the kind of initial ambitions for the agreement. But ultimately, as I think even President Trump conceded, I'm not sure it'll be a matter of weeks per se. It might be longer than that we're going to sort of hammer out the details over the next couple of weeks and months.
Ali Redison. The National Farmers Union welcomed the government maintaining standards, not allowing imports of hormone-treated beef, for instance, but said that 2 agricultural sectors had been singled out to shoulder the heavy burden of the removal of tariffs for other industries in the economy, and warned UK agriculture cannot continue to shoulder such imbalances in future negotiations. NFU President Tom Bradshaw.
We cannot be sacrificial when it comes to further negotiations that look to try and lower those tariffs. Agriculture can't give any more to protect the rest of the economy. And at the moment, bioethanol tariffs have been reduced. We don't know what that will mean for the future of our bioethanol manufacturing here in the UK, and therefore what that means for the demand of our crops that go into bioethanol. So there's still uncertainty around that, but we also have to recognise this isn't back to zero tariffs. There'll be further negotiation, and UK agriculture hasn't got any more to give within that negotiation.
Tom Bradshaw. So 13,000 tonnes of American beef can now come to the UK tariff-free, with the same amount of UK beef going to the US, also without a tariff. Charlotte asked Neil Shand, Chief Executive of the National Beef Association, if that's a good deal for UK farmers.
We've had worse deals. Let's put it that way. From the information we've got at the moment, 13,000 tonnes reciprocal, so in and out. But we don't know if that's per month, per year, or 5 years. There's no timeline on that yet. So it is hard to say how good a deal it is. My gut feeling is it could have been worse.
How competitive can UK farmers be on price in comparison with US ranchers?
Well, at the moment, our price has increased significantly since the start of the year, and American base costs are much lower. And perhaps one of the positives that might come out of this in the long term is that the Westminster government look at supporting more British-produced beef.
Although equally, consumers might just buy on price.
Predominantly, consumers do buy on price, and it remains to be seen when and if US beef arrives, how it's priced and which bit of our market it ends up in.
And I guess we have to keep this in proportion, because currently it's 0.05% of the UK's beef imports which come from the US. So even the exponential increase that the Americans are talking about might not actually be huge.
We have to be realistic. We do import beef. We're not self-sufficient. And as an organisation, it's equally important to us that the consumer is able to source beef.
As you say, this could have been worse. There was some expectation that beef which had been fed growth-promoting hormones might be allowed. Are you confident that is definitely not going to happen?
We've heard the Prime Minister and we've seen a copy of his written statement. So there should be no hormone-treated beef arrive into the UK. Of course, we'll watch that very closely, and the labelling and traceability will be monitored very, very closely.
There's also talk about trying to get a better agreement with the EU. How important is that in comparison with this?
It's our closest market. The 13,000 tonnes market that may be now open in the US is very small in comparison to what we already send to the EU. All the noises are that we are getting slightly closer to the EU on many fronts. We have to maintain our trade with the EU. That's vital to agriculture as a whole, but certainly to the beef industry. And I really don't want to compliment the government, but there's an argument that the trade deal from today is certainly better than the previous government did with Australia and New Zealand.
That's Neil Shand. Well, you've been in touch with us about this US trade agreement, and Roger Burton emailed to say, am I being totally dim? What's the point of a deal where we can import 13,000 tonnes of American beef and we can export 13,000 tonnes to America? Is the cost of fuel, emissions, administration, etc. insignificant? So much for net zero. And Valerie Forsyth picked up on the same point. Nothing really makes sense, she says. That's transport costs both ways, plus costs in time, fuel, handling, and more transport either end. How can we be totally guaranteed that their beef is as well cared for? And this from Jill Dean. All the handshakes and self-congratulation completely ignore the biggest crisis we're all facing, climate change. What has happened to reducing emissions in the production of livestock? Well, the government here in the UK says the agreement will boost trade. The Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Steve Reid, told Charlotte they've got a good deal for UK farmers.
Well, this is a really good outcome for the UK. The government's negotiated in the national interest, and we've got a really good deal that will benefit the entire economy. But it's also a good deal for farming and for agriculture.
Although farmers point out that it's two agricultural sectors, as they see it, singled out to shoulder the burden of the removal of tariffs for other industries in the economy, like cars.
This is a good outcome for British agriculture. The fact that we've got almost exclusive access to the US beef market, the biggest market in the world, is really a huge opportunity indeed. And it's reciprocal, so the same quantity in either direction.
Yeah, and that is a worry, isn't it? Because the US beef is going to be a lot cheaper. There's going to be an impact there.
Well, it's only 1.5% of the total UK market, and my guess is it's going to be looking more at the premium end of the market. The deal works out better for British producers because they have access to a much bigger market in the United States. That is a real opportunity to sell a premium British product at a premium price. That is going to benefit British agriculture. And, we've never said we're going to be protectionist. The NFU has never said to me they want protectionism. They've said they want a level playing field on which British producers can compete and win in our own domestic market. That's what we've given them. We have not undercut on environmental or welfare standards.
The American Agriculture Secretary is really, really keen to get agreements now on poultry and pork. How likely is that?
Well, there will be ongoing conversations now, but the big pressure is taken out of these conversations because the deal has been done on cars and pharma. And those were the big ticket items. The deal today has saved tens of thousands of jobs in those sectors. So we can now move forward and have a much more measured, calm conversation with the US about how we look at other lines. It's not just going to be in agriculture. There's the whole food and drink sector, things like whiskey, things like gin, things like chocolate, that we want to get into those into the US market as well. But we do it under no pressure. And we've now established principles such as reciprocity, such as no weakening of our standards, that mean that our British producers are in a very, very good position as a result of this deal.
I just want to talk briefly about ethanol, which is used in fuel. E10, for instance, which you might see at the petrol pumps, is 10% biofuel. Some concern from arable farmers about the impact of on the viability of home-produced ethanol once you remove the tariff from American imports. That's a real concern, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll listen to their concerns, but just to put this in context, less than 1% of arable land in this country produces the grain that goes into bioethanol. And there are alternative products it can go into, like biodiesel, for instance, and other products. So I think it's something that we can live with. This was a negotiation. there was a conversation going on. We've done what we needed to do to protect the wider British economy, but also to get British agriculture, a very, very good deal.
DEFRA Secretary Steve Reed. And that's all for today. I'm Kaz Graham. The producer is Beatrice Fenton, and Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.